Welcome back to Sip&Talk. I'm Joe. So, you know how we dig into a pile of information you send our way and pull out the coolest bits for you? Well, today we're taking a deep dive into something called the backfire effect.
Exactly. And it's quite a thing.
Quite a thing is right. Basically, the backfire effect is this kind of weird phenomenon where, like, you show someone solid proof that what they believe is wrong, and instead of them going, okay, maybe I should rethink this, they actually, like, double down and believe their original thing even more strongly.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? Like trying to argue with someone who's absolutely convinced.
Totally. It reminds me of trying to tell my uncle his meatloaf recipe isn't great. The more evidence you present, the texture, the unique aroma, the more he insists it's like this 5-star dish.
Yeah.
So why does our brain do that?
Well, big piece of it is something psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Right. Dissonance, as in like mental discomfort.
Exactly. That really uncomfortable feeling we get when we hold two ideas in our heads that just don't match up. And that ties into another thing, confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Where we kind of look for stuff that proves we were right all along.
Precisely. Our brains naturally gravitate towards information that confirms what we already think and tend to ignore or dismiss stuff that challenges it.
So it's like our internal search engine have a filter for things I already agree with. And when something slips through that says, nope, you're wrong, boom, backfire.
Pretty much, yeah. Or at least that's the idea. Think about it this way. For a lot of us, our beliefs aren't just thoughts. They're tied up with who we are.
How so?
Well, they connect to our identity, our values, maybe the social groups we belong to. So when someone challenges a really core belief, it can feel less like a discussion about facts and more like a personal attack.
Oh, yeah, okay. Like if someone criticizes your favorite band or something, it feels like they're criticizing you.
Right. Exactly. It triggers a kind of self-defense mechanism. And that confirmation bias you mentioned, it goes into overdrive. We start actively looking for reasons why the new information is wrong.
So you start thinking, oh, well, that source is biased, or those experts, what do they really know anyway?
Precisely. Find flaws, question motives. And there's often a really strong emotional component here, too.
Emotions, okay. How do they fit in?
When beliefs tied to our identity get challenged, it can stir up powerful feelings, anger, anxiety, maybe feeling defensive. And those emotions can kind of hijack our logical thinking.
So our feelings are basically shouting down the facts, like, nope, don't listen, stick to your guns.
In a way, yes. And, in today's world, we're just bombarded with information constantly. It's overwhelming.
Tell me about it.
So sometimes just sticking with what you already believe feels easier. It's like a mental shortcut. Reevaluating deeply held beliefs takes real effort.
Yeah, it's like deciding whether to switch phone brands. The new one might be better, but learning a whole new system, sometimes you just stick with what you know.
That's a great analogy. So yeah, the backfire effect, or even just this resistance to changing our minds, it really shows we aren't always these purely rational creatures logically weighing evidence. Our feelings, our sense of self, they play a huge part.
Okay, so that's the basic idea of what it is and kind of the psychological gears turning behind it. Now let's get into some real-world examples you pulled from the sources, because that's where it gets, well, really complex. Let's start with mainland China and Taiwan.
Right. So for many people in mainland China, a very core belief, deeply ingrained, is that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. It's fundamental to their national narrative, education, everything.
Okay, a bedrock belief. So what kind of evidence exists that might challenge that?
Well, you have the reality on the ground. Taiwan functions as an independent democracy. They hold their own elections. They have their own currency. The new Taiwan dollar, they issue their own passports, maintain their own military.
And crucially,
numerous polls and studies show the vast majority of people actually living in Taiwan do not identify as Chinese. They identify as Taiwanese.
That's a lot of evidence pointing towards de facto independence, right? So how does this evidence interact with that core one China belief, according to the backfire effect model?
Well, instead of prompting a rethink, this evidence is often labeled as lies, propaganda spread by Taiwanese independence supporters, or maybe manipulation by so-called anti-China forces in the West.
So presenting the evidence actually makes them dig in harder.
In many cases, yes. It can strengthen the conviction in one China, sometimes leading to even more fervent calls for reunification, even potentially through force. The contradictory evidence is seen as a provocation.
Wow. So what's the psychological thinking there? Why does it backfire so strongly?
It goes back to that identity piece. Challenging the one China principle feels like an attack on Chinese national identity itself. on the legitimacy of the nation's status. Decades of consistent messaging and nationalistic education embed this belief very deeply, and there's often immense social pressure to conform.
So it's not just disagreeing about facts, it's almost like questioning who they are as a people.
It can feel that way, yes, which leads to dismissing the evidence, maybe selectively interpreting history, focusing on certain documents, while ignoring Taiwan's decades of self-rule. The emotional response, anger, perhaps a sense of betrayal, overrides the factual information.
The stronger the evidence for Taiwan's separate status, the more fiercely some might defend the original belief.
That seems to be the dynamic often at play, yes. The emotional investment is just incredibly high.
Okay, that's a huge geopolitical example. Let's shift to another one you highlighted from the materials Russia and the conflict in Ukraine.
Right. In Russia, the dominant narrative pushed by the state describes the invasion not as an invasion, but as a special military operation. The stated goals are often things like liberating Russian speakers or denazifying Ukraine. This becomes the core belief for many.
Okay, the official story. And what's the contradictory evidence?
Well, you have widespread international reporting, satellite imagery, on-the-ground accounts showing Russian forces bombing civilian infrastructure, apartment buildings, hospitals, schools. You have millions of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the violence, and near universal condemnation from international bodies calling it aggression.
A very different picture from liberation. So how does the backfire effect manifest here?
For those who accept the official narrative, this contradictory evidence is frequently dismissed as fake news, as Western propaganda, part of an information war waged by the U.S. and NATO against Russia.
So seeing reports of civilian harm doesn't shake the belief. It actually reinforces the idea that Russia is being unfairly attacked with lies.
It can, yes. It can increase trust in the government's narrative and strengthen the belief that the West is out to get us. Again, psychology plays a role. Nationalism is powerful, drawing on historical narratives like Russia's role in defeating Nazism in World War II, which gets repurposed.
And the information environment itself.
Crucial. There's heavy state control over media in Russia, significant censorship. Access to independent information is limited. Plus, there can be a real fear, conscious or subconscious, of questioning the government line, especially during wartime.
So even if someone sees something troubling, they might rationalize it.
Exactly. They might reinterpret evidence of civilian harm as being staged, or the fault of Ukrainian forces, or necessary collateral damage in a just cause ways to resolve that cognitive dissonance without abandoning the core belief.
It really highlights how potent a controlled information space combined with nationalism can be. Okay, let's bring it to the U.S. context, the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Right. A significant segment of the U.S. population, primarily conservatives, developed the core belief that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 presidential election, and it was stolen due to widespread fraud.
And this belief persisted despite
numerous recounts, audits, dozens of court cases being dismissed by judges across the spectrum, including Trump appointees, statements from the Justice Department under Trump's own attorney general, and confirmations from Republican election officials in key states that there was no evidence of fraud on a scale that could have changed the outcome.
Even some media outlets that initially pushed fraud claims had to walk them back. Right?
Yes, some major right-leaning media outlets faced lawsuits and had to issue retractions or clarifications regarding specific false claims about voting machines or processes.
So, faced with all this contradictory evidence from courts, officials, even previously trusted media, what was the backfire reaction for those holding on to the stolen election belief?
For many, rather than changing their minds, this evidence was interpreted as proof of just how deep the conspiracy went. It wasn't just Democrats, it was the courts, the Justice Department, rhinos, Republicans in name only. The media, the entire system was seen as corrupt and aligned against Trump.
So the evidence against the conspiracy became evidence for an even bigger conspiracy.
Exactly. This fueled movements like Stop the Steal and amplified numerous other conspiracy theories online. The psychological drivers here include, again, that deep sense of identity tied to a political figure or movement. There's also a significant pre-existing distrust of institutions.
And maybe the difficulty of admitting you were wrong.
Absolutely. Admitting the election wasn't stolen would, for some, mean admitting they were misled, or that actions they took based on that belief were perhaps misguided. That's psychologically very difficult. It's often easier to believe the countering evidence is just more lies from the establishment.
It really shows how identity and trust or distrust shape how people see facts. Now, it's important to maybe add a little nuance here, right? Because some newer research suggests this full backfire isn't always what happens.
That's right. It's a really interesting update to the story. While those initial studies highlighting the backfire effect got a lot of attention, some more recent large-scale research has found it might be less common than originally thought.
Oh, so maybe trying to correct misinformation isn't always doomed to fail. Slightly more optimistic.
It is. These studies, like one by Wood and Porter in 2019, tested reactions to corrections across many different issues and found that, more often than not, people did update their beliefs somewhat in response to factual corrections. The strong backfire, where people became more certain of the wrong belief, was actually quite rare.
So what's happening more often than, if not a full backfire, people just ignore it?
That seems closer to what might be more common. It's sometimes called attitude maintenance or just belief perseverance. People might encounter challenging information, and instead of doubling down, they might just discount it, ignore it, forget it quickly, and basically stick with their original belief without it necessarily getting stronger.
Okay, so less of a dramatic U-turn into wrongness and more like just staying parked in the same spot, maybe putting up the window shades.
That's a pretty good way to think about it. They don't strengthen the incorrect belief, but they don't readily abandon it either.
Gotcha. So even if the extreme backfire is less common, we still have the significant challenge of people not being receptive to information that contradicts their views. And that leads right into the whole issue of, online echo chambers and fake news today.
Absolutely. Social media algorithms, especially, are often designed to show us more of what we already like and agree with. This can create these filter bubbles or echo chambers where you're mostly hearing voices that confirm your existing biases.
Right, your feed becomes this comfortable little reinforcing loop.
Exactly, so you're shielded from opposing views or challenging facts. And then when you do encounter something that contradicts your worldview within that space, especially if it challenges a belief tied to your identity, that defensive reaction we talked about can still kick in.
Even if it's not a full backfire, you might just dismiss it instantly as fake news or biased, because it doesn't fit the narrative you're used to seeing.
Precisely. You might just scroll past it or mentally file it away as untrustworthy, reinforcing your existing stance without necessarily getting more extreme, but certainly not changing your mind.
So these online environments can make it harder to have productive conversations across divides because they're not even operating from the same set of perceived facts.
That's a huge challenge. The backfire effect, even in its milder forms or as simple belief perseverance, really underscores how tricky it is to navigate disagreements and process information, especially when emotions and identity are involved.
So, circling back, maybe trying to convince my uncle about the culinary merits of his meatloaf using facts alone is just not the way. It's probably more about his pride in it.
It very well could be. Understanding the underlying emotional connection or the identity piece, maybe it's a family recipe, maybe he just loves making it, might be more insightful than arguing about the texture, though probably still won't change his mind about the meatloaf itself.
Yeah, probably not. But it's a good reminder for all of us, right? When you encounter information that clashes with what you believe, maybe take a beat. Ask yourself, am I really considering this, or am I just instantly looking for reasons to shoot it down because it makes me uncomfortable?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? Self-awareness about our own potential biases.
Definitely. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Can you recall a time you encountered info that really challenged a strong belief you held? What was that initial gut reaction? Did you push back immediately, or did you pause? What do you think might have led to a different reaction?
We hope you found it insightful, maybe a little thought-provoking. Tune in next time for another episode of Sip and Talk.